So welcome everybody this evening to this book launch of Mobile Manuscripts by Dr. Christopher Bahl. Christopher Bahl is an associate professor of South Asian history at Durham University. And I noticed that he did his first degree at Heidelberg before going on to get a proper education at SOAS, where he did his an MA and a PhD, which he completed in 2018. He's also held several really interesting research and study positions at Damascus University, at Central University Hyderabad, and most recently at the Orient Institute Beirut in Lebanon, before taking up his position at Durham. His research is on South Asia's place in the wider Western Indian Ocean region in the early modern period, specifically as revealed through the circulation of Arabic manuscripts and Arabic learning and Arabic scholars. And it thus is part of a wider trend of Indian Ocean studies that seeks to reimagine or redefine the region away from perhaps land-centric definitions of South Asia, India, and the like, and look at the circulation of ideas and peoples through across maritime routes in areas in ways that we are not used to thinking about. There has been, in this respect, he does follow a little bit in the footsteps of several scholars and fellows of the society, including Ronit Ricci, Niall Green, Tanya Bhattacharya, and several others. However, most of those scholars have focused on a Persianate world and the circulation of scholarship and forms of learning connected to the Persian world. And one of the several unusual things that Christopher has done is interject a different form of circulation associated with Arabic, which in fact defines a very different geography. And his work takes, starts as far west as Cairo, and goes at least to the Mughal court, and perhaps further east. And his research and his writings have focused on Arabic learning, both with respect to history writing, but also grammars and philology, a topic which would interest many members of this society, with this rich history in philology. So it's really a pleasure to hear more about Christopher's book, which I've started but not finished, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. So thank you for coming down from Durham, and let's give him a warm welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for having me. Also, thank you to Alison and to Matty for organizing this, and thank you all for coming and for spending the evening here. So I wanted to take this lecture also as an opportunity to thank a few people, also colleagues and friends who are here in the audience. For exercise of writing a PhD thesis not far from here, as you mentioned, at SOAS in 2014, and shortly before I completed the PhD, a slightly more senior colleague told me that pursuing a PhD was actually just solving a problem that you created in the first place. So that was a good dose of sobering counsel. Nevertheless, I had a lot of support over the last years in solving this problem and then in turning it into another problem and publishing a book. My supervisors, Konrad Hirschler and Roy Fischel, who is here today, and Derek Mancini-Lande shepherded me through this first process, the first problem, and out of sheer kindness, Konrad and Roy kept talking to me for the second problem. So thank you both very much for that. I started revising this book during my first postdoc at the Orient Institute in Beirut, in Lebanon, and I finished it after taking up my job at the history department in Durham. And both places were and continue to be formative for me. I especially want to thank my department, who really created a supportive environment to finish this book. And I encountered many supportive people along the way who helped me figuring out the second problem. And among them are Abdallah Soufan, Justin Willis, Tom Hamilton, Joe Martin, Radha Kapuria, Stefan Hans, Nursu Baskan, and Matt Johnson. At Cambridge University Press, the series editor, Sujit Sivasundaram, and the editorial team, Lucy Reimer and Rosa Martin, Julie Knox, and Titus Pratish Murugayan were an excellent collective, who guided me through the entire publication process. And also the Bahl and the William families provided much joy, love, and support over the last years, and I thank them for their kindness. So last but not least, I want to thank my wife and my young daughter, Everly, who sadly could not travel down with me today, but they allowed me to pursue those problems over the last years. Alice traveled with me across India to those archives. She had to listen to me rambling on about manuscripts, and then she even read through those arguments again before print. So thank you, Ali. You and Everly kept me sane over the last years. Now moving on to the book. What I want to do today is focus on one manuscript and the different mobilities that shape this manuscript to exemplify what I'm trying to do in the book. Now, this is a manuscript copy which is held in the British Library. It's part of the Azhar Mahal collections, and I'm going to say more about it later on. So let me first set the scene for the talk. This is a map of the Western Indian Ocean, and previous scholarship has crafted many exciting narratives about what connects or integrates this space. The monsoon winds allowed seafaring communities to establish a schedule for transoceanic movement, going eastwards during the early summer and westwards during winter. Over the 15th to 17th centuries, traders bought pepper in Malabar and sold it in Yemen and Egypt. Slave merchants shipped people from East Africa to Gujarat and the Deccan in exchange for textiles. And Muslims from the Islamic communities of South Asia and beyond congregated in Mecca and the Hijaz for the annual pilgrimage. So we see a range of connections, networks, and mobilities that traverse the Indian Ocean. Port cities such as Jeddah, close to Mecca, Aden in Yemen, Surat in Gujarat, and Calicut on the Malabar coast developed into entrepôts, cosmopolitan places that harbored merchant communities from across the Indian Ocean world. And those places were very much attuned to the schedule of incoming and outgoing commodities, all subject to the prevailing winds, of course. Thus, we can plot a range of different stories of human activity on this map, and in the end, they will all be entangled to different degrees. The result is a dense formation of economic, social, and political interaction. But what is mostly missing are cultural narratives that draw the communities of this region together, and I think in particular with regards to Arabic connections and mobilities. As has already been mentioned, there's previous research, of course, there always is. The connected histories approach by Sanjay Subrahmanyam, for example, has pushed us to go beyond the area studies divisions, according to which we've often studied East Africa, Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia separately. And there are many colleagues who heeded the call. For example, also the aforementioned Ronit Ritchie, who has developed this notion of the Arabic cosmopolis and explored the travels of one Arabic text, the Book of 1,000 Questions, through tellings in Tamil, Javi, Malay, all the way to Southeast Asia. What never got lost in translation was the rich Arabic vocabulary that entered these languages. It created Arabicized Muslim communities that adapted local stories of conversion to their place of belonging, while imagining a larger trans-regional Muslim community that, with whom they shared an entire system of cultural references. So this is where my research wants to build on and introduce a different conduit of text circulation. Arabic manuscripts and Arabic texts written, copied, commented on, and some eventually also forgotten, on the move and in places from Cairo to the Deccan in South Asia. Those written objects constitute an empirical connection to explore transoceanic exchanges. And based on Arabic manuscript cultures, we can consider the Western Indian Ocean, and here I mean, here I start in Egypt, via the Hijaz to Yemen, Iran, Gujarat and the Deccan, as a trans-regional world of Arabic manuscript circulation, with communities on the many shores and beyond who peruse them. Thus, the aim is to add another layer on this map, a trans-regional formation of Arabic learning that built on other mobilities that I talked about beforehand, but that followed its own rationale. And in the book, I argue that Arabic learning, mainly in the form of Arabic philological knowledge, spread across the Western Indian Ocean during the early modern period. And I pursue this on the basis of Arabic manuscripts that are today held in collections across Europe, such as the British Library, across India, for example, in Hyderabad and in Rampur, in Cairo, in the Al-Azhar Mosque Library, for example, and in Istanbul in the Süleymaniye collections. I trace these histories of circulation of Arabic manuscripts by studying their manuscript notes and paratexts, so the colophons, the reading notes, the ownership statements, to look at the social and cultural mobilities of texts, the communities that shared them, and the practices they created, as well as the places where they did so. And the main argument that I'm putting forward in the book is that surviving manuscripts allow us to study a field of Arabic learning that link people, places, and practices from the Red Sea region to South Asia during the 15th and 17th centuries. And today I will exemplify this argument by focusing on one manuscript, its history of circulation, the different intertextualities that shaped it, as well as the political, social, and cultural conditions that shaped its creation. So going back to B3, this is a manuscript copy of a grammar treatise entitled Al-Wafi by a scholar called Al-Balkhi. And the treatise is the one written in large letters, so 5 lines on each folio. And this text really gained popularity in South Asia and beyond because an Egyptian scholar who traveled from Egypt to South Asia in the 15th century wrote a grammar commentary on it. And we see his grammar commentary is part of the interlinear and marginal notes that we see on this manuscript. This manuscript itself is a 17th century copy by a scholar who resided in the city of Bijapur in the Deccan and who copied it in the shrine library there, presumably from another manuscript that was stored there. More about that later. So based on the manuscript notes that we have on this manuscript and the marginalia, I will explore how that scholar and scribe engaged with the text, modulated his manuscript, and the different cultural and intellectual pursuits that he thereby shared with peers in South Asia, in the Red Sea region, and in Istanbul. Let's start with the text itself. Muhammad Abu Bakr ad-Damamini was born in the northern Egyptian town of Alexandria in 1362, and after a successful life of scholarship and a less successful life in business, he died in 1424 in the city of Gulbarga in the Deccan. He wrote several commentaries in the disciplines of poetry, theology, and grammar. And during his scholarly education, he passed through many prominent institutions in Mamluk Egypt. He studied in Alexandria and Damascus and in Cairo with different teachers. But then he decided to do a detour into the weaving business, which went up in flames and left him in deep debts. So he literally burned his option of switching careers and going into the weaving business in Alexandria. And after a humiliating experience in Cairo of settling his debt, he considered it best to start a new chapter ashore. Thankfully, he was a well-versed scholar, and he could stand on his own, leave his home turf, and pursue a career as a migrant scholar abroad. The South Asian subcontinent was very much en vogue at that time. He wrote several grammar commentaries on the way, which he presented as literary offerings to the sultans of Gujarat and of the Deccan, the Bahmanis. And thus he continued his scholarly career. Al-Damamini is part of a larger wave of scholarly migrants from and to the subcontinent during the 15th century. And we know this because there are several Arabic dictionaries written in Cairo and in Mecca during the 14th and 15th centuries, which show us that there is an increase in transoceanic movements between those places. In particular, there's the biographical dictionary by Muhammad as-Sakhawi. And he registered a lot more Indians than his predecessors who are coming over from the subcontinent, especially to Mecca and Medina, but also they travel further to Cairo and Jerusalem. And they don't only go on this arduous journey across the ocean to go on pilgrimage, but they also come to copy texts, to attend reading sessions, and to receive teaching certificates from the great masters. At the same time, we see more and more learned figures that traveled in the other direction as well. So from the Hijaz, from Egypt, and from Yemen to the subcontinent. And that is because those mobile scholars spotted professional opportunities that were building up in the subcontinent. Lavish patronage offered at the newly emerging courts in the 15th century. So in the late 14th century, Timur Tamerlane defeats the Delhi Sultanate, and that's sort of the last nail in the coffin of the Delhi Sultanate. And many of the regions of the Delhi Sultanate become independent courts. So for example, Gujarat, Bengal, Jaunpur, and others emerge as regional sultanates. And those newly emerging courts were eager to attract and recruit learned people and administrative personnel. So migrant scholars who faced an increasingly difficult situation of finding stipends in Cairo and other places made a run for jobs in India. And Al-Damamni is not an exceptional, but rather an exceptionally well-documented case. There are entries in the major biographical dictionaries, but it is especially the grammar commentaries which he composed on the move that offer us information about the cultural practices of a mobile scholar. What Gérard Genette called the paratexts, those elements of a work which render the text sociable and receptive among a readership, tells us a lot about Al-Damamni's scholarship on the move. And here this includes the prefaces, where he tells us something about the royal patronage that he received. He writes long eulogies to the or dedications to the sultans, and he also tells us how he moved from one place to the next. The colophons tell us something about the framework of transmission, so how he ended up producing the commentary, and the style of commentarial elaboration throughout the commentary tells us something about the audience that he wrote for. So those paratexts navigated the social and cultural circulation of his works among patrons, students, and other scholars. And the commentaries are the following. I'm not going to read out each title, but what I wanted to show you is that with each commentary, we actually get the trajectory of his travels. So the first one was produced in Cambay in Gujarat in 1417, 1418. Then later on, he writes the second one in 1421 at Nahrawala in Gujarat, again a grammar commentary. And the final one he writes on his way to Gulbarga in the Deccan in 1422, 1423. This is the important one that I'm going to focus on today. So the Al-Manhal As-Safi fi Sharh al-Wafi is the commentary that he wrote on the Al-Wafi, the treatise which he thereby popularized in India during that time. And he wrote this, as he writes in his commentary, on the island of Mohaim, which is just off the coast of Mumbai, which is not on the map, but you can certainly sort of place that. He presented it to the court of the Bahmani Sultan in Gulbarga, and thus became a recipient of royal patronage. Here you can see the extent of the Bahmani realm and the Vijayanagara Empire to the south in the 15th century. As part of the transoceanic move, Al-Damamni successfully navigates a shift in patronage networks. There are differences in how things are done in Mamluk Egypt and how they are done in South Asia in that period. So in Mamluk Egypt, he was dependent on scholarly posts, often funded through endowments, waqf. So he had to approach institutions, receive stipends from different mosques and madrasas. In South Asia, on the other hand, he approached courts to receive a more direct form of royal patronage, where the Sultan often gave patronage directly to a particular scholar. And this fits with previous scholarship by Kozlovsky, who emphasized the difference between the institutionally mediated, like in the first case of Mamluk Egypt, and the direct courtly patronage, as in South Asia. In Mamluk Egypt also, Al-Damamni had composed commentaries in the context of a closer scholarly supervision. Often when he wrote his commentaries. In India, he increasingly engages with grammar treatises on his own and without any form of scholarly supervision. Especially the Manhal As-Safi is a commentary which he writes in the preface, which he hadn't known before. He's asked by students on the way from Gujarat to the Deccan to help them with the difficulties of studying the Arabic language. And so he writes this commentary. Earlier commentaries are also based earlier commentaries that he writes in Mamluk Egypt are based on a particular scholarly canon. So when he explains the treaties, he often refers to other scholarly authorities that were part of the canon in Egypt, or the Mamluk Sultanate more generally. In India, however, that canon doesn't exist to the same extent at that time. So what he does is he moves over to simply explaining it on a lexicographical level, on a semantic level, what the different terms of the treaties actually mean. But he's not referring back to any scholarly authorities at that point. What he produces thereby is a very successful mobile scholarship. Because over the following centuries, we can see that al-Amami's texts are copied across South Asia, in the Hijaz, in Cairo, and in Istanbul. We can find his work in many of the collections that are held now as part of the Suleimani collections, and that were previously dispersed across in madrasas and mosques across Istanbul. Now let's move on to B3 and what it can tell us about the spread of mobile scholarship over the following centuries. From the 15th to the 16th, 17th centuries, many things have changed in the Deccan. So the Bahmanis disappear, and over the 16th century, we find 5 Deccan sultanates that are formed. Ahmednagar, Bijapur, and Golconda in particular continue to attract scholars and professionals from across West Asia and the Red Sea region, as the Bahmanis had done beforehand. And in Bijapur, the Royal Library demonstrates this transregional entanglement and the connections of the court. As Salimuddin Qureshi and Keelan Overton have shown, especially Iranian migrants shaped the Arabic and Persian collections in the Royal Library of Bijapur. And we can see that through library notation, through ownership statements, and seals on the manuscripts, which are today housed in the British Library, not far from here, catalogued by Otto Lord. What is important here is that those collections develop initially as private collections of individual sultans. Often those manuscripts are not copied or produced in Bijapur, they're copied and produced somewhere else and brought as gifts to Bijapur, to the sultans. Then later on, they are successively moved into the Royal Palatial Library over the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, what happens in the 17th century is that Sultan Muhammad Adil Shah decides to move those royal collections into a new building, which is built outside of the palace, still connected to the palatial complex through a bridge, but it's outside the palace and thereby more accessible to learned communities in Bijapur and those coming from beyond. This Azhar Mahal Shrine Library had an endowment to finance teachers. There were artifacts there, like several hairs of the beard of the Prophet, which were brought specifically from Mecca by a scholar. And I argue in the book that this place now becomes what I call a textual entrepôt, a place for incoming and outgoing books and manuscripts. So it stored books for readers and allowed them to copy those texts in situ. So what the sultans did is they basically recycled the Royal Library collection to make it accessible again to a scholarly community. And thus, they allowed those manuscripts to become mobile again and to become artifacts which could be transmitted, written artifacts that could be transmitted. And this B3 is the product of such an intensive studying effort in the Azhar Mahal Shrine Library. It is markedly different from other text versions of this, like in this one where you can see that the initial treatise is written in red ink and the commentary is written in black ink, right? This is a sort of a dense text block version that you have to read through. Now, in this case here, we have the 5 letters of the initial treatise, and they are explained or commented on by different interlinear and marginal comments. This is a studying enactment rather than a reading enactment in order to differentiate the two. Found out is that B3 is a copy of another manuscript from the Azhar Mahal Library, B2, because the comparison reveals that B3 first of all, we see there's the same layout, but if we look at the comments then, and I looked at this again, the same marginal notes are copied in B3 as they're copied in B2, right? So one is a copy, B3 is a copy of B2. We know the scribe of the copy B3 because he put his signature on this page. His name is Makhdoom Qadi Kabir al-Millah wa Din ibn Qadi al-Kabuli, who was a judge and might have been, is probably a member of the scholarly elite who were recruited and patronized by the court in this period. Now, the Persian notations that we find on the flyleaves of this manuscript tell us how those manuscripts circulated in Bijapur. So on B2, we see a library entry note into the library dated to 1594, 1003 Hijri. On B3, there's a note by a librarian of a Sufi library, the Qadiriya library, which states that this manuscript entered Qadiriya library in 1664, and then later on made its way into the Azhar Mahal in 1680. Now, as I've said, both manuscripts have the same textual format, and a comparison reveals that the exact same sections of commentaries appear in the margins. To make this more digestible, I will show you my superior visualization skills. So presumably the copyist of B3 arrived in Bijapur, had access to B2, and produced a transcription, B3, of the text. This book then made its way to the Qadiriya library, was brought by a person named Taj Muhammad. This is mentioned in one of the library notations. And then later on, it returned to the Azhar Mahal collection, where it lies until today. What we can also see is before the title page is a list of commentaries with symbols as identifiers to be applied throughout the manuscript. So each of these here is a different commentary, and those abbreviations are used as identifiers throughout the commentary. So what we can see here is, on one page is the library of books that the scribe of B2, or scholar of B2, had at his disposal, and the comments that Makhdoom of B3 then continued to study in the margins. And among them are all three of Al-Damamini's grammar commentaries, but also other commentaries that were read across the Red Sea region, the Eastern Mediterranean, South Asia, but then also later summaries and things, mahsuls they're called, so summaries and digests of those grammatical works. Now, let's consider the wider context in which this studying enactment is happening in the 17th century. What we can see if we compare the manuscripts in three different collections in South Asia is that there's an increase in the copying of Arabic manuscripts, in particular from the 16th to the 17th centuries. So what I did is I conducted surveys in the Rampuraza Library in North India, in the Salajang Museum Library in Hyderabad, and the Asafia Library collections of the Nizam, today held in the Oriental Manuscript Library on the Osmania campus. And I only looked at datable manuscripts, datable according to the colophon, often then also dated by the people who produced the catalogs. And if we only look at datable manuscripts, we can see that there's a slight increase from the 15th to the 16th, but there's quite a stark increase towards the 17th century. And this is based on texts in the Arabic philological disciplines and Arabic rhetoric and sorry. This, of course, is a quantitative argument. People might say numbers don't really matter. But we can see, based on what other scholars have argued for other regional languages, be it Marathi, Telugu and others, we can see there's an increase in the production of paper across South Asia for this period. So we actually see this with documentary practices in other languages. There are more opportunities for scribe to insert themselves into those textual circulations. And what I think we can show here is that to some extent that is also true for Arabic manuscripts in this period. But there are also qualitative changes by which we can study this, how texts were copied, circulated, and read. And today I'm only focusing on one particular paratext in order to show the qualitative changes that are happening in the 17th century. So another paratext that was added to B3 is a fihrist. It's a table of contents of a manuscript. And here I want to focus on this fihrist to show what the fihrist can tell us about reading practices and studying efforts in this period. What I argue in the book is that from the Eastern Mediterranean to the subcontinent, what we see in the late 16th and 17th centuries is the appearance of the fihrist as a new reader-centered device. So this is not the internal fihrist that we often find in the introduction of a text, what you could call the internal fihrist, which is an intertextual feature that appears often at the end of the introduction or the preface to a work, and sort of works as a roadmap to the reader to see how the argument is going to develop over the book or its contents. And those fihrists encode a successive evolution of ideas of the work into a set of succinct terms and phrases. However, this external fihrist, what I want to call it, is a paratext that is added later on, does not spring from the pen of the author, but is added by a reader or a scribe. And I base this on an extensive survey, again, in the Arabic philological texts or disciplines, manuscripts held in Cairo, Istanbul, Hyderabad, and Bijapur. And of course, there's a general problem of manuscript survival in this period, and especially that manuscripts from the 15th century would have gone lost easier than those from the 17th century. But I think what we can see is there's a general absence of tables of contents for the 15th century, as an appearance of them in the 16th century, and a stronger appearance again over the 17th century. I stopped at the end of the 17th century for convenience sake, but we could probably go on with that. So I think because we have this change in the paratextual culture, I think there is a diachronic argument that can be made. So to show you other examples, this is the second commentary of Adamamini, and this is a fihrist from the Charula collection in the Suleimani in Istanbul, where the different grammatical terms that appear throughout the treatise are mentioned, and what they also mentioned are folio numbers. So those terms actually become findable. This is another version of a different grammar commentary in the Suleimania, and here's one from the Al-Azhar in Cairo. Now, I argue that readers introduced this device to render the texts more accessible. And this innovation is part of a larger transformation in learned encounters during the early modern period. As proposed by Khaled Al-Roayhab, there's a change in what he calls deep reading practices that people talk about and write about in Istanbul in the 16th century. So there are several normative treatises that appear in the 16th century that talk about how you can read certain texts by yourself and how you should read other texts with a teacher. And those texts that you can read by yourself are, for example, philological texts. So this invites people to pursue more personalized readings and personalized study. And it's something which doesn't completely change the landscape of knowledge transmission, of course, but maybe starts in parallel, develops a parallel to the socially embodied forms of knowledge transmission that were practiced, where a student had to study with a teacher, receive an ijaza that he had studied that text, and then was allowed to transmit the text. The fihrist makes the commentary and its underlining treatise more accessible as a reference work and as a studying device for individualized, personalized reading. Most significantly, when you compare those different fiqhists, you can see that their individual engagement with a text by a reader, where each manuscript and each fiqhist is a unique reproduction for that particular work, often based on the structural particularities of the version, the length of chapters, sections, so that would also produce different folio numbers. Now, there's one particularly nice case where the manuscript, after it had been completed, and this is the first commentary of al-Damamini, after the manuscript had been completed, it was handed over to a scribe. So there is a scholar called Muhammad al-Kazani who copied this commentary in Mecca, and after he had finished, he handed it over to a scribe called Qutb ad-Din, and that scribe produces a separate fiqh, a separate colophon here for this fiqh. So we have one colophon for the text, we have a separate colophon for the fiqh. And what this Qutb ad-Din, we only know his laqab, so his title. What he did is he produced quite an analytical fiqh, or an analytical table of contents. And thus, I think we can argue that apart from the fact that scribes copy texts and thereby went through the text, they become part of the readership of those texts and have to engage with those texts very intensively in order to produce those fiqhs. So we can trace transformations in reading strategies as documented historical practices on manuscripts. And we can see how communities from Istanbul via Cairo, Mecca, and to Bijapur were part of these shared knowledge systems, as Francis Robinson phrased it in Arabic philology. Sheldon Pollock and others recently formulated the most common denominator for world philologies, namely making sense of texts over time and space. And this captures the significance of this new paratextual culture, I think, quite literally. Grammar, rhetoric, and lexicography, while there were disciplines and traditions in their own right, were often used and were instrumental in particular ways because they allowed you to make sense of other texts, such as Quran, Hadith, fiqh, and so on. And by the 17th century, scribes and scholars had developed new techniques to make sense of texts, which ultimately shaped the ways in which they made sense of other texts. And tracing the circulation of these texts can show us how they developed new frameworks to read and study important works. And since these frameworks suited very similar academic needs in the Eastern Mediterranean and the subcontinent, I think we can consider those practices to be connected in cultural exchanges. And it is these connected cultural flows that I want to conclude with now, and to offer some ideas of about how we can conceptualize and study such transoceanic exchanges in the early modern period. And so it is in particular the notion of the cosmopolitan and the notion of the local and those shared histories that connected Egypt with the Deccan. So what we've seen is that al-Damamini engaged with cosmopolitan text in a very local and specific context. He has his commentarial elaboration that he creates in a particular way. He has a very particular audience. He receives patronage from a sultan. But over time, his commentary becomes placeless over the following centuries and thereby more cosmopolitan. And I'm using here terms used by Sheldon Pollock and Brinkley Messick, who have employed them in their study of cosmopolitan and vernacular written cultures. Messick in particular developed a pair of the cosmopolitan and the contingent. So on the one hand, we have, and he does that in the context of Yemen and legal texts. So on the one hand, we have legal treatises, which are read in almost everywhere, which are placeless. They're read in Yemen, they're read in Egypt, and so on. But then we have legal rulings, the actual implementations of law, which are contingent and very local and very specific. And this conceptual pair can be applied to circulating manuscripts and to their paratexts as well. And this is something that Konrad Hirschler has done as well for the study of Hadith manuscripts in Damascus. So if we apply this to B3, the manuscript that I showed, it means that on the one hand, we have texts that are very cosmopolitan, placeless, and read very widely. And so are trees that we find in the margins. The paratextual culture, on the other hand, the list of commentaries, the fiqhs, the scribal notation, and so on, they're all contingent elements in that moment, which make this text, what is manuscript version, very specific, a very specific enactment, a historical moment. But at the same time, this paratextual culture turns out to be cosmopolitan again as well, because we can see that this particular practice of producing a fiqh list, producing a table of contents, producing those marginalia on a manuscript is something that we can see in Istanbul, Cairo, Mecca, and Bijapur. So audiences in those places engaged with the same texts that had become more portable, easier to engage with and to transmit because of the commentarial elaboration that was not bound up with a specific local or regional canon of scholarly authorities. But at the same time, those learned readers engaged with those texts through similar practices and thereby created similar paratextual cultures, among them the fiqhs. Nevertheless, what remains are individual, contingent, and particularly local ways in which learned readers apply different paratextual elements to their manuscripts, and how they elaborated them, and what this can tell us, or can't tell us in many cases, about a personal learning experience in the early modern period. So to sum up, it is the study of cosmopolitan and contingent textual practices on those mobile manuscripts that allow us to approach thicker cultural, intellectual, and social histories of the early modern Western Indian Ocean. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes, happy to take questions.
The only trick is, because we have people online,
Yeah.
I have to repeat the question. And,
Oh, right, okay.
Which I can, would you like me to do it for you? I'm going to ask the first, yeah, okay. But I'll ask the first question.
Okay, good.
Thank you for really interesting talk. I was all sorts of crazy ideas were sparking as were sparking as you were speaking. One of the things that immediately struck me was how some of the philological techniques that you both identified with the original text, the change in Al-Bamani's from as he moved from Cairo into South Asia, you said his textual practices had changed, and that much of what he was writing, he developed new techniques based on semantic analysis. And so that was the first thing that struck in my head. And then as you were discussing the commentaries, you were talking about sort of the contingent nature, which is also a type of semantic approach in a way. And that got me thinking about parallel developments that were taking place within Sanskrit philological traditions in South Asia. And so I was wondering whether there was evidence of these scholars engaging with Sanskrit traditions, and whether there was some sort of dialogue going on at the time, both within Al-Bamani's own writing, but also as was compounded by the various commentaries.
Right.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Should I? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've spoken to the microphone.
No. So yeah, thank you for that. Actually, so the direct link is something that I could not find, but also because, for example, with Sanskrit, I don't work with, I don't know Sanskrit, so I can't make this link. There's a book called Translating Wisdom by Nair, by a scholar from Harvard, who was written about the exchange of philosophical knowledge between in Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic. So I think, yeah, so maybe in that context, what I try to do is try to think about the different cultural changes that underlie those changes in 17th century. So they production, availability of paper, so the circulation of texts, the storage of those manuscripts, and thereby look at scholarship that has worked with other regional languages and argue that there's an underlying, there are similar practices that are pursued, but I can't make the direct link at that point. Yeah.
Very interesting. It's kind of appreciated. Following up the comment you made, brought immediately to mind the paper. The Sultan ruled that case judged. So you have Sultan ordering medieval commentary. Big outbreak. Where it relates. I did have the manuscript's called B3, puts up high on B for numbered, you know.
Yeah.
And you look at the catalogue of the law, it's way down in grammar. Middle. I was wondering, I'm sort of interested in who came up with do we know?
Okay, so the question from the floor from Michael is has to do with the cataloging entry, cataloging of the manuscripts B1, B2, B3, but also there being another catalog which has it cataloged differently and less prominently. Is that
1877?
In 1877, yeah, it was push. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about the older.
Yeah. So why the new order as opposed to the old order? Is that it?
Yeah.
Is that it?
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Michael. So you can really go down a rabbit hole with those things because Otto Lord created a fascinating catalog, but he based his catalog on earlier catalogs that were actually produced by scholars in Bijapur. So there's an Urdu catalog which was based on Persian notes by a scholar in Bijapur. And what I haven't done is look at what are the changes in the cataloging practices between those different stages. So I don't know if, for example, the numbering of the Bs refers to the order of how those manuscripts were placed either in the palatial library or later on in the Azhar Mahal library. So I don't know at this stage. No. So we could, maybe this is something you can glean from the other earlier catalogs, which are available as part of a government report, which also explains why those manuscripts were moved to London. But no, I can't do this. Yeah.
Chris.
Yeah, that was fascinating, very impressed. But anyway, is it the case, as you implied, I'm not sure that's very true, is it the case that this is an entirely literate, book-based culture you have been describing, in which it's like us, doesn't like it? Given that this is occurring within a wider culture, prizes were out, everybody Western person
Mm.
understands the importance. So is there any trace oral culture you've been talking?
So Chris Fuller's asked a question as to whether the wider orality that existed in South Asia as a vector through which knowledge was transmitted was whether you still see whether the wider Muslim world, whether that whether you see resonance of that within the written texts that are emerging at this time.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So I think so. First of all, what I can see and study and what I focused on is the written aspects of that. There are of course other elements of the oral culture that still persist, like the practices in the practice of knowledge transmission is still in many cases a practice that has a very much an oral element where you read it out to a teacher. There are of course many oral modes of transmission in South Asia in different languages that I can't go into. So there's definitely that oral culture is still there. What I think changes in this period is that for certain text traditions and for certain studying practices, the written becomes more authoritative. So before the oral mode of transmission has a more authoritative, gives you legitimacy in transmitting a text further. And I think what's happening here is that it becomes acceptable for certain traditions to circumvent that or for particular texts, and to actually engage with knowledge by reading texts, reading books yourself. There's a famous scholar, Suyuti, in Egypt, who writes about this himself, about the fact that there are those oral traditions, but that he's actually more trustworthy of books that have been written, because those books have they don't make new mistakes, those books. So yeah, I hope that answered.
Thanks for the interesting talk. I wanted to point out that when you were talking about the Asafia librarians, you made the comment that at that time there's a possibility for the scribes to inscribe into the text, but this brings in the problem of distortion rather than being lost in translation is added in translation. And when it's coming down also orally, all these things could happen until it gets written down. So how can do you have any means of measure or coping with that kind of change? And also the last point which came up, why is it that there's no a prior reason why the written form should suddenly get more authority from an oral tradition? Is it because it is less subject to distortion?
All right, so a double-barrel question. The first one had to do with copying, making copies of manuscripts, and what the well, how often, whether it provided an opportunity for the scribe to interject their own voice into the manuscript and make changes. And the second one was second question. Actually, could you repeat the second half of your question?
Oh, well, I just added from the last question that why this question of
authority switched from the oral to the scribal. Yes.
Okay, thank you for that question, for those two questions as well. So again, that's sort of the problem. I'm sort of trusting what I see. So when I look at the manuscripts, I'm always happy when those manuscripts tell me as much about their circulation history as they can. So in general, I trust that those circulations, I mean, there are, of course, there are cases of forgery. There are also some manuscripts where where the cataloger suggested that this is the author's copy and it simply can't be. There are those cases, but in general, what I see are run-of-the-mill scholarly productions of texts where people were interested in documenting when they had copied a text and with whom they had studied the text, and so details to some extent. What happens in the 17th century, 16th, 17th centuries as well with those scribes is that they changed the colophon to inscribe themselves more prominently. So they changed the textual format of the colophon to really put themselves in the middle and say, I am a resident of Burhanpur in the Deccan, and I copied this text and my name is such and such. And I think because those texts circulate more widely and other people, it's a way of advertising that you're part of that, that you become part of that tradition. The change to a more written culture, I mean, there are larger changes happening in this period, which can serve as a context, the emerging bureaucracies across the South Asian subcontinent, where the use and availability of paper again and the textual practices become more widespread. But I can't answer the sort of the origin question about why that's happening at that point. But thank you.
Thank you, Christopher, for that very rich talk. But I couldn't help while you were speaking in Majid's Indian Ocean text, how far he's writing 100 something, maybe a little. 15th century, maybe. Yeah. 1400, yeah. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could elaborate, if you have any circulation of that text in South Asia as well as because I read it years ago.
Do you want to say? Okay.
So it's about Ibn Majid's text, which is he's a navigator and pilot who writes up lots of information about the monsoon winds and about streams and currents and so on, and how to navigate the Indian Ocean. I don't know anything about the circulation of this text in particular. I use this text in one of my courses with students to tell them how people wrote down in the 15th century ways of navigating using the monsoon winds to navigate the ocean, how to be careful of particular currents and so on, and how this information was versified, and which hints again at something that was brought up earlier, where the oral element, if you have a versified text, it's easier to memorize it. So how this text might have circulated not only in written form, but also as sort of an oral culture that people try to remember. But I can't speak to the circulation of the text in those contexts. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
My question comes from, I work mostly with Persian manuscripts and look at Persian and the Western world. So it's completely out of curiosity. You ran us through some content papers. And my first question is that, is it usual for Arabic manuscripts of that particular era to have content papers? Because Persian manuscripts did have that. The second question, again, may actually be outside the very scope of this. I might apologize in advance, but I really loved how detailed you trace the circulation of manuscripts between the Western Indian Ocean and the Deccan, especially the Hijaz, as far as the Red Sea, as far as Egypt. Do we also see similar transactions happening with Mughal North India? And particularly after 1573, when the Mughals taken over Gujarat and inherited the Red Sea corridor from the Gujarat Sultanate, do we also see a lot of circulations, intertextuality, transactions, the scholarly networks of the Deccan Mughal North?
Okay, thank you. So the first question was about the content pages and how widespread they are, and the second question was to what extent the Mughal takeover of Gujarat changes circulations across the subcontinent. Yeah, thank you. So no, not all the manuscript versions have fihrists, but I'm quite happy whenever I come across the 16th or 17th century version of another text and I see that a table of contents. No, I don't think it's a phenomenon that we see everywhere, but that is particular to certain manuscript versions. But we see it in other texts as well. So we see it in biographical dictionaries in the 16th, 17th centuries have, in addition to those marginal notes of the name of the person the biography is about, we see a list at the beginning often. Well, but again, not in every case. Your second question is quite a big question, but it's a question I think that could be worked on more. There are other colleagues who are working with the Delhi collections, which are held in the British Library, the Delhi Arabic, the Delhi Persian, which to some extent contain the manuscripts of scholars of the imperial court and so on. So that's a treasure trove. And just if you look through the Delhi Arabic section, you see, I would say the majority is grammar, rhetoric, and things like, so texts which would fit in the auxiliary disciplines which help you to engage with the language and study other texts. I can't speak to the change that happens, but of course that's quite interesting if something happens at that point. But for example, Al-Si al-Koti, who is a scholar at Shah Jahan's court, writes commentaries on tafsir, on grammar, on rhetoric, and they are all in Istanbul as well by the 17th century already, and then 18th century as well. So there's definitely a circulation happening, but the extent of that is something that is, at least I don't know.
Okay, we'll give Roy the last word.
Thanks, really wonderful. Like where you took it forward. Bigger, rounder, more systematic. Two quick questions. Well, one quick. I don't remember if it was B2 or B3 when you have the details of circulation and in and out libraries.
Yeah.
There is one thing that springs as not belonging.
Yeah.
And this is this one.
Yeah.
Top right. Modi script.
Yeah.
I assume it's Marathi. I don't
Yeah.
know Modi. We were not kind of transcribed to the Devanagari, but then did you have a chance to find something? I know that it's really difficult to find these days someone who reads Modi script. I wonder at which point this manuscript left this nice, cozy Persianate or Arabo-Persianate world ecosystems of libraries and collections and went to someone who wanted to write in Marathi.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting question about the afterlife. That's the easy question. The difficult one is genre. So I know that you worked on particular collections, so it might be out of your study here, but one of the interesting things that if I find in this circulation is that, and it's quite a lot when we think about cosmopolitan and circulation of text as kind of like free flow of in and out.
Yeah.
But I do think that there are hierarchies within that. There are centers which consider to be important and texts are produced there and then are greatly circulated. And there is Bijapur, right? Nothing which is produced there doesn't go far enough, except for Furish, right?
Yeah.
And it's true also how they engage with the locality or the things they find out on the ground, right?
Yeah.
So genres like historiography or tarikh, at least Persian, doesn't care about them. They don't like them, right? If they write about them, it's usually, and that's back to Firishta, it's the Bahl incident, right? But then you have Firishta writing about medicine, right? I'm quoting the wonderful book by Emma Flatt, that she looked at the medical compositions of Firishta, that, yeah, all of a sudden there is a whole ocean of Ayurveda that he borrows. Do you think in the Arabic, this world of Arabic text, do we have this kind of variety? Is that particular texts are always projecting composed in Egypt or in the Hijaz into the Deccan? Talk to those people that need instructions because they don't understand and then goes away? Or do you see much more? Yeah, I know it's a big. Much more of an engagement with the locality of listening to what's going on the ground.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Roy. So I'm trying to sum this now up for the Zoom audience. So the first question was about the Modi script on one of the manuscripts. The second question was about if there are hierarchies in places and localities where Arabic texts are produced, or is there more authority with texts from particular places rather than other places? Yeah. So the easy one. So I can't read the Modi script, but I know that Lot has a reference about it that might have to do. I mean, there are bilingual documentary practices, as you know, so it might have also happened earlier, but those manuscripts are, or the Bijapur library is under the supervision of the Principality of Satara, and then later on the British, and then they're moved out. So it might be, I mean, we have the seals of librarians of the Mughals, of Aurangzeb. Then we have this stage of the Modi script, so that might be when it was just shifted, there was a different political authority responsible for those manuscripts. So yeah, but I also haven't found one who could read that now. Now the second question. So there is, again, the manuscripts in the Bijapur library can tell you something about, maybe hint, I'll give you an answer to that. So some of the texts, especially texts in jurisprudence, but also in grammar, they have Ijaza notations from Mecca, which are very prominent on the fly leaves. So I think that to some extent, if you're looking for a particular text, you go to Mecca because everybody else goes to Mecca. Or often everybody else goes to Mecca. So Mecca is definitely something like an entrepot for those texts where you can find the teacher you want to copy the text with and so on. So Mecca is definitely a place that is also often mentioned in the colophon, because often the scribes don't mention who they are, and they also don't mention when or where they copied the text. So which always, where I ask myself, you went through all this labor of producing this, why don't you just say? So I can't wrap my head around that, for example. But there are hierarchies in where the transmission of the text, I think, is particularly legitimate or authoritative. There are also texts which are specifically authoritative in producing continuations later on. So Ibn Khalikan's dictionary of the 13th century that records Muslim scholars from across the world back then. We see a recension or continuation written in the Deccan in the 16th century by a scholar from Medina, who is a scholar in residence, receives patronage from the Nizam Shahi sultans, and produces a continuation where he works with the biographies of Ibn Khalikan, but then adds some other biographies himself. So again, I think, especially when it comes to historiography, there are models from the Red Sea region, from Cairo and other places, which are quite valuable and are being used again. But yeah, that would be another step to actually look at the different hierarchies and look at, yeah, I don't think that cosmopolitan means everything is everywhere. You're right, there are hierarchies there. Yeah, thank you.
I think we're going to stop there, but I did note that there is a table of contents in the book and an extensive index, and so we can I can highly recommend it to everybody to read. So thank you very much, Christopher. We can continue the discussion informally over drinks.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. It's really interesting. And I'll finish it. Yeah. Can I get you?
Between your career.
Can I get you a?
Yes, it's